This morning, reading from the prophet Khalil Gibran on joy and sorrow. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the selfsame well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come. And when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. The risk of pleasure, the reward of pain. Good morning. This is my first time in this pulpit, although not the first in this sanctuary, and I've always felt it to be a warm and welcoming presence to be here. So I'm happy to be with you here today, and may our gathered presence be a blessing to each of us and to all of us together. When I was 17 years old, I became an only child. My older sister, Linda, died of an autoimmune disease, which had been diagnosed when she was 6, with a prognosis that she'd live at best to age 12. But my sister, 2 years my senior, was really tough, and she toughed it out for 7 years past her predicted death. She was skinny and pretty, a goalie on the high school field hockey team at 105 pounds, almost disappearing behind all the protective equipment. And she was my protector and my hero, because I was more vulnerable and frightened of the world than she could afford to be. As her progressing illness challenged the simple, essential act of breathing, and she spent weeks, then months in the hospital, our family tilted on its axis and then began to slide down towards inevitable grief. When I visited her in the hospital the night before she died, I had no idea that I'd never hear her voice again, and not a clue of how deeply I loved her and would, for all my life, miss her. It took me decades to realize how that loss would cost me, how much my parents' grief would accompany their future, and that there's a mystery in the hole that lost love leaves behind. But until I was able to connect and to engage that grief, I hid away from my pain, and hiding got in the way of honest joy. It obstructed joy. And that conflict of passions is what I want to share with you today, that we're only whole when we live together in the space of both happiness and grief, of pleasure and pain. Our integrity as individuals and in community requires that we live together with happiness and with grief, with pain and with pleasure. Now, I'm a mostly retired neuroscientist, as well as a minister, vocationally a chaplain. I'm a chaplain assigned primarily to a palliative care service, so I spend my days in the hospital with people who are at the end of their life. Being a scientist isn't so much a profession as it is a state of mind. I think it's the active response to a generalized curiosity about the world and how it works. The research I conducted advanced along a seemingly very crooked path, beginning with graduate school investigations of photosynthesis, then shifting to molecular mechanisms that account for electrical activity in nerves, muscles, and the heart, and the drugs and toxins that help or hinder these mechanisms. From there, it wasn't a big leap to focus on pain-conducting nerves in the peripheral tissues in our bodies, those things that tell you that you've touched the hot stove or the door has closed on your finger. And then to segue to try and understand what causes prolonged pain after surgery and what causes pain in many types of cancers. But then to step from physiology to psychology, from sensation to emotion, in order to address the suffering that almost always attends chronic pain. That was a big leap. That took a calling, and I hesitated twice, uncertain of my own motives and resources, before answering that call. The suffering that people experience from these conditions, chronic pain, terminal disease, dementia, and psychic loss, showed me the doorway that I had been unknowingly seeking for a long time. Ministry of chaplaincy is the calling that brought me to divinity school, ordination as a UU minister, and, as today, an occasional stint in the pulpit. So this morning I want to talk about pain and pleasure, and what they mean for our survival and our growth as individuals and as a species. Pain and pleasure are often paired as two opposite experiences. Simply put, pleasure makes you feel good and pain makes you feel bad. We seek pleasurable experiences because we're programmed by evolutionary stresses that determine survival, programmed to act in ways that bring good feeling. Eating, tasting, smelling, touching, physical exercise, sexual activity, all lead to a greater probability of surviving the challenges of existence: disease, malnutrition, physical weakness, underpopulation. In contrast, the displeasure of tasting toxic substances, the discomfort of injury or threat of injury, the sadness of social isolation, all lead us to avoid those life-threatening situations. Even the most primitive single-cell organisms respond to nutrients that will advance their growth and reproduction by moving towards them, up the gradient of concentration of good stuff, and away from potentially harmful conditions and substances that are toxic. Of course, we higher animals use a much more elaborate system of perception and deception to code the simple sensory inputs into complex experiences, colored by past happenings and by future expectations. Yet, still, if we place pain at one end of a scale and pleasure at the other end, we usually find our direction as moving as far as possible towards the pleasure pole and away from the pain. After all, who doesn't want to enjoy the experiences that maximize her or his survival? To decide otherwise would appear to be tinged with self-hate, self-abuse, self-destruction. And yet there's a paradox in this arrangement, one that rests at the center of the apparent tension between pain and pleasure. You see, my friends, if we only and always seek pleasure and never address pain, then we're only living half a life. For several reasons. First, pleasure is so much more pleasurable if we have an experience of pain to contrast it with. Now, I'm not proposing some masochistic binge in order to feel so bad that its ending leads us to experience the relief that makes us feel good when you walk out of the dentist after the procedure. Rather, I'm saying that a warm blanket is that much cozier when we've just come in from a freezing day. Second, if we work to avoid pain with all of our effort, then we cut ourselves off from the greater dimension of living. When we have to work very hard to avoid any pain, we've less energy to experience all of life. Then we operate in fear that we'll be hurt in a way that may injure us beyond repair. And we miss risking many experiences that include both pleasure and pain, which probably includes most experiences in life. As Khalil Gibran invites us to do in today's reading, joy and sorrow come together. And when one sits alone with you at the board, remember that the other is asleep in your bed. Third, we can't grow if we don't venture away from our pleasure pole and try feeling pain. Pain is unavoidable. Buddhist lesson number 1, life is suffering. Accept this as truth, and you'll see that the fullest experience of life accepts rather than shuns pain. And this acceptance allows us to expand along the complete pain-pleasure axis. As we experience more, we learn more, and we feel more. And my friends, I believe that we know the joy of being with a sense of completeness that enriches us far beyond the simple pleasure of good sensations. Ultimately, wherever that is, the joy of being is our greatest reward in living. Think about that for a moment, that the joy of being is the greatest reward. Can you feel joy without analyzing it? Can you experience that? And here's a consequential paradox. Allowing unpleasant experiences actually enhances survival. At its simplest expression, it triggers a rapid response from harm and also teaches us to avoid the spaces where harm happens. This holds for psychological emotional harm as well as the physical type. Pain facilitates growth, and it also exposes us to negative feelings and associations from which some immunity might arise. Then, if a really challenging life situation does occur, and we usually have no control over such happenings, we are more able to respond to it and to survive. If we were always clinging to the pleasure pole, we'd never learn how to face the inevitable bad stuff. For our individual survival, we must take the risk and lean out to face discomfort and worse. And a second paradoxical reality, there is truth in the phrase, too much of a good thing. An unregulated pleasure center can be a prime motivator for addictions, a target for commercial exploitations that develop cravings for their products with manipulations of taste and smell, or with the ubiquitous coupling of one product with some pleasurable sensory experience. For example, a svelte woman singing sexy songs, or a rugged lone cowboy riding into the mountains, both to sell cigarettes. Or with the fantasy of happiness through acquisition of things. How these psychological truths apply to our children is worth discussion as serious as that of climate change, I think. In fact, it's an important part of that discussion, but not this morning. We seek a balance between these two aspects of our being, a dynamic balance that recognizes the essence of being as inseparable from the impermanence of everything we think we know and allows an enlightenment, which is why we seek it. Now, isn't this also true for ourselves in relationship? To truly know another, we must be willing to hear their happiness and their sorrow, their pleasure and their pain. But how can we do that if we haven't had our own sad bad experiences. In order to be present for another with empathy, we have to have engaged our own experience of suffering. We don't need to say anything. We just need to be fully present, aware of ourselves with another, practicing intentional compassion, my friends. Intentional compassion. In closing, I invite you to recognize the value of resilience in engaging pain and suffering. All of us have individual psychological, emotional, and spiritual resources that help us rebound from injury, that we can marshal in times of great stress, of loss. Sometimes we can reach them through individual effort, the solace of meditation, the company of poetry, the balm of music. And sometimes resilience is a gift of community, of this church community, and the care and love you share and risk here with one another. And sometimes we find resilience when we are able to disengage from our own pain and turn our generous spirit to the larger community. It's the last promise of the great covenant to help one another. Amen, and blessed be.